My name is Liz Arcane, and I am a singer, writer, and educator. Hello, I'm Liz Arcane, singer, writer, and educator. Welcome back to this week's episode of Versus Verses, where I take an affectionately comparative look at the vocals and songwriting skills of two linked artists. In this week's case, musicians Lou Reed and Nico, who were both an integral part of the band The Velvet Underground in the 1960s. When I was a wannabe songwriter, I started about the age of 15 when I part-exchanged my violin, very wisely, for a guitar and was shopping for affordable CDs in record stores which would give me the kind of musical education I sought, but on a budget. I happened upon Lou Reed's 1973 album Berlin. All of his music, I should say, has been hugely influential, but this album especially. I also think it had some negative impact to my detriment because it encouraged me to wear more black eyeliner and mope around even more. But swings and roundabouts, as they say. Now, the album Berlin was hated by Rolling Stone magazine on release. They called it a disaster. The writer Stephen Davis commented that it was the kind of album which was, and I'll quote this, so patently offensive that one wishes to take some kind of physical vengeance on the artist, ending by saying farewell to Lou Reed's solo career. And here was me thinking that all of the really critical music reviewing and music journalism happened in the 1990s. The album is described as a concept album about a couple who were mentioned in an earlier song by Lou Reed. The producer of the album, Bob Ezrin, essentially asked to know more about the couple. There are many ways this album has had an impact on me. For one, it justified the kind of German cabaret-style pre-Hollywood studio system musical theatre sound, which I love so much. As well as this, the sort of misery-core sound of the album, which artists like the Smiths and The Cure had already swallowed me up in, was clearly on show here, not to mention the fact that Reed was a contemporary of David Bowie. All these things led me to Lou Reed and therefore to that album. Anyway, we're not here to talk just about Berlin, Lou Reed's 1973 album, although I could do it all day. In fact, his album track, The Bed, was a hallmark of a particularly depressing acoustic set I toured around London open mics in the mid-noughties. We're here to compare his vocals and songwriting with the other best-remembered vocalist from the band The Velvet Underground, Nico. Let's start straight away with a similarity. Both singers, on paper, are weak vocalists. Perhaps that's one of the things that brought them together as musicians. They came from very different backgrounds. Nico was an actor before she was a singer, and to understand the background here, we probably need to take a closer look at the Velvet Underground of the band themselves. What came first? Well, in 1964, Lou Reed was working as a jobbing musician and songwriter when he met John Cale. John Cale was born in Carmarthen, Wales. John Cale is known in particular for an unusual vocal style, for violin and songwriting, and he has a fascinating background and back catalogue, and I urge you to read his autobiography, What's Welsh for Zen. Already we have a surprising contrast, and indeed the Velvet Underground themselves do seem to be a band of contrasts, or at least from hindsight. Classical versus modern musicianship. Cale received a Bernstein scholarship, and that's how he ended up in New York. American, Reed was born in Brooklyn versus Welsh, and serious versus lyrically flippant about many controversial topics. And there I'm talking about Lou Reed and his songwriting in general. I mean, many of the best-known songs are about drug use and abuse, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. By 1964, they had their best-known lineup, including drummer Mo Tucker, and as a sort of sidebar, I'm a huge fan of her simplistic, childlike style, especially as a vocalist. And then here's where the art forms begin to collide. Artist Andy Warhol, yes, him of the soup cans and the famous 15 Minutes fame, became the band's manager and linked them up with Nico, a German-born singer. And over time, they gradually developed their sound alongside the rather modern concept of visuals on stage during the performance, such as a stroboscopic light show designed by artist Danny Williams. Now, they're often pictured or thought of wearing sunglasses, and reportedly this was actually due to trying to protect their eyes from the stroboscope that was happening around them. However, they incidentally looked enormously cool and influenced numerous indie sleaze bands of the 2000s with their striped shirts, their denim and their shades. So thank you for that, Velvet Underground. By 1967, they were ready to release their debut album, and I truly believe it is one of the best pop indie, and I don't use that classification lightly, albums of all time. Now, you might ask, what makes it pop music? Well, it's deeply catchy, singable, it's endlessly being rediscovered by modern musicians and listeners, despite the fact it is almost 60 years old. And it leans more towards the admittedly rather vague indie genre by dint of its painfully honest and challenging lyrics. It's also known for some extremely ahead of its time artwork on the part of Warhol, wherein the ubiquitous banana on the cover could actually be peeled. Regardless, I love this album, and it sent me off on a bit of a tangent. Let's just think now about these two vocalists and their singing styles. In fact, let's peel slowly and see, as a sticker on said album cover proclaimed. Now, both Reed and Nico could be described as having a droning vocal, but I feel this is a bit of an oversimplification. If we look at two songs in focus, this will become easier to examine. I've chosen Femme Fatale, sung by Nico, the French title doubtlessly linked to Andy Warhol's description of her as a chanteuse or female singer, which may or may not have been a bit of a joke. And I'm Waiting for the Man, sung by Lou Reed, which has an instantly post-Bob Dylan casual grumble to it, also called I'm Waiting for My Man, depending on the version. Now, both songs are quite hard to classify musically. The latter showcases their garage rock sound, although I doubt it was known as garage rock at that time. It could be easily seen as proto-punk, since it has that pounding, driving rhythm, negative sort of overall mood, and lyrics which vaguely conceal the topic of seeking drugs in Harlem. It's an ugly, chunky and addictive song, written by Lou Reed and produced by Andy Warhol, who clearly didn't know what he was doing. And I feel that is kind of the point. The song sounds like a living narrative, as if we're following the speakers along the grimy streets mid-conversation. It's deeply messy and uneven, and it's just the kind of in media res sound which makes the Velvet Underground such an excellent, visceral band. Vocally, Reed uses a lot of Sprechensang, speak singing. He's no opera singer, and that should be obvious. He's telling a story and often missing the notes of the melody in doing so, but that is part of his genius as a songwriter and as a singer too. After all, it is really hard to write in an honest way, and even harder then to actually carry out that same message and mood and feeling when singing the song. It takes a certain amount of actually talent or truth or honest performance, which I think some singer-songwriters severely underestimate. All of this is what makes Reed such a fantastic vocalist. His voice is like a living thing, and in this song and also the song Heroine, he speaks perhaps not from the heart, but certainly from the place where his heart should be. The German actor, singer and model was in a few films such as La Dolce Vita and Chelsea Girls before Warhol introduced her to the band. Now, anecdotally, I have heard her vocals called tuneless, abrasive, ugly. She's a precursor, though, to punk singers like Polystyrene from X-Ray Specs and Susie Sue from the Banshees, Debbie Harry from Blondie, who occasionally apes Nico's flat and sarcastic delivery, albeit more frequently hitting the actual note she's aiming for. And that's what made Nico stand out to me so much when I was learning to sing and learning to write music. Yes, Lou Reed is the songwriter in this case, as well as in most of the songs on the album, but Nico has that same living feeling in her vocal and a certain sense of irony and intelligence, and yes, tunelessness, which just wasn't really permitted in female singers in those days, or to my limited experience in the 90s when I began learning about music history. And therein is the genius of Nico. Rather like Lou Reed, they both subvert that traditional idea of what it means to be a good singer. As such, their vocals are focused more on transmitting a message than creating an instrumental sound with their voices. Like contemporaries Bob Dylan, John Lennon, and others, their songs are more about the story being told than a sound you can just ignore in the background. As I said before, Femme Fatale was also written by Lou Reed, and he was the primary songwriter on the album. Therefore, doubtless he is the best songwriter in the Velvet Underground, although I'm sure some fans of John Cale would disagree with me. Musically, that song has a relaxing shuffle, completely different to the driven rhythm of Waiting for My Man. And Femme Fatale has that same sort of sweet, nonchalant sound as another song from the album, Sunday Morning, in that case sung by Reed. Now, apparently Femme Fatale was written about Edie Sedgwick, a rather tragic it girl of the time. And the idiom of the title, it means a woman who is so sexy that she could cause a fatality to whoever she entrances. Now, there is a certain irony for me in Nico singing it, and it is one that I actually think that she is probably aware of, as her vocal tone is particularly sarcastic here. The woman of the title is objectified with a lyrically male sound, and it suggests to me that originally the song was meant to be sung by a man, as the speaker of the song, as in the singing vocalist or the main character, is sort of warning other men against getting involved with this femme fatale, saying that they'll just become number 37 in her phone or appointment book, and that she's just a little tease. And in my experience, that's very rarely a phrase that any woman would say about another woman. But here in the song, Nico's vocals are perfectly imperfect, and she has that flat German vowel sound, femme fatale, which seems to mock Lou Reed's objectification and sort of bitterness towards the femme of the title. Perhaps adding what is a potentially feminist layer to what is superficially a rather sexist song. To conclude, with Nico and Lou Reed, I love them both. And as with earlier episodes, my findings really are that you can't have one without the other. However, these days, if I had to choose, I'd choose Nico. Her dense alto tones crush through the songs like petrol floating on the surface of the sea, pulling focus and taking you out of the moment, and making you question or think about Lou Reed. It's conjecture, of course, but I'd hope that that's what the presence of her in the band was for, as though she is there as a kind of counterweight to Lou Reed himself, to put him somewhat in his place. And that's important to me to think, even if it is something I'm imagining, because Nico is often posthumously sexualised, linked to Jim Morrison, notably in the film The Doors by Oliver Stone, and thought of more as a bit of eye candy and someone attractive than somebody who has some musical validity. This change, in my opinion, is very interesting to me. It tells me a lot about my journey as a songwriter and as a woman. Berlin, Lou Reed's album from 1973, really fascinated me as a teenage songwriter. But I'd like to end by turning to Nico on her own, which is what I have done the more I've begun to appreciate her as a musician. As many women of 35 and upwards will attest, it's around this age that you start to realise the amount of female artists and musicians and people of importance that you just saw being sidelined casually when you were younger. Perhaps you even played a part in sidelining them, but that is really down to society and culture and conditioning, and I do sincerely hope it's beginning to change. I love Lou Reed and I love the album Berlin, but it is Nico who continues to fascinate me as a person. Working as a solo artist after the Velvet Underground with musicians like Tim Buckley and Jackson Browne, before rejecting the support of men in her life completely, and recording her own album Chelsea Girl. Working with artists like Tim Buckley and Jackson Browne, before Jim Morrison is reported to have suggested she started writing her own songs. She did record an album which was mainly covers, Chelsea Girl. However, she then went away and developed a sort of proto-gothic sound for her album of originals, The Marble Index, which is characterised rather ironically by returning to the drone-like sounds of the Velvet Underground, this time through her use of harmonium, which, if you know the instrument, you will know, it might make you think of things that are nautical. It's often used for nautical sound effects. It's often used to create a sort of droning sound in Indian and Pakistani music as well. And it does create a kind of chord-like undercurrent, which is rather unsettling. And also to think about the way in which she wrote the album at a time which the music journalist Matthew Lindsay described in magazine The Quietus as a time of liminal drift. That is to say, or to suggest at least, that perhaps she had her own creative awakening, took her full circle and back to avant-garde music like the Velvet Underground, but this time it was through her own agency. Out of the two singers, in the simplest terms, hers is the voice which stays with me. It's the voice that I mimic, perhaps in an unflattering way, and the voice that rings around my mind in a dark and a frantic echo, making her, for me, the true Velvet Underground. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Versus Verses. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, or whatever you prefer to do. And look after yourselves.